Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 517. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. We got a good amount of news to get through on today's show. As usual, things do kind of slow down as we approach Christmas and New Year's here, at least in the US. So probably the shows will be a little bit shorter, but I do plan on putting out an episode on either Sunday or Monday. That would be Christmas, either eve or day. Maybe if news is really slow and I don't have very much to cover, we might wait until Tuesday the 26th to put out the next episode. But just to give you all a little roadmap on what to expect. And we did have a bonus episode this week. Misty Winston was back on the last episode of the show to give us updates on the situation with Julian Assange, which is, of course, so important. All right, before I get into the news today, I want to remind everybody to head on over to the Libertarian Institute and make a donation. This is our end of the year fundraiser. We are approaching the end of the year. We are over halfway to meeting our goal. So if you head on over and make a donation today, figure it out with your tax people. We are a tax deductible organization. So figure out how you could pay us and not the U.S. government, which will, of course, use the money to either fund the war in Ukraine or Israel or Taiwan. Something that we don't want. And with that, and if you can't, I know times are tough. Sometimes things around the holidays could get a little bit tight money wise. Just, either share that we have the fundraiser going on or share the episode of this show. Just do something to try to put it out there to some more people. And of course, I really appreciate it. I know a lot of the donations, I've talked, with people at the Institute, a good number of the donations that are coming in, a portion of them at least have to do with, listeners of this show. And so I really appreciate you guys giving donations. One of the donors actually asked that I say the date of the show in the beginning. So today is December 22nd, 2023. I'm going to try to remember to do that at the beginning of every episode from now on. Let's get into it. First up here. Senate adjourns until 2024 with no deal on Ukraine aid. This is something that we've been covering on the show throughout really the month of December, highlighting that we could come up to a situation here in January where the White House doesn't have any funding available to arm Ukraine. And so, let's get into this article here from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. The Senate adjourned for the holidays on Wednesday without reaching a deal on Ukraine aid and will not return to Washington until January 8th. And so I guess, a couple years ago and really up until October 7th, Ukraine was the most important thing happening in the world to democracy. And now Congress can afford to take off 2.5, 3 weeks and not debate it at all or deal with it. So I guess it really isn't important to that people, not as important as their long holiday breaks, huh? The Senate was initially due to break for the holiday recess at the end of last week, but Majority Leader Chuck Schumer had senators return on Monday and tried to reach a broader deal to unlock a massive $111 billion spending package that includes military aid for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. Republicans want significant changes to asylum and immigration laws to restrict the flow of migrants entering the country before approving the foreign military aid package, which includes $60 billion to fund the Ukraine war for another year. The White House has indicated it's willing to support the new immigration restrictions, but it's unclear when the deal will actually be reached. According to The Hill and White House negotiators, and Senate, I guess Republicans mainly, have agreed to hold virtual meetings over Christmas and New Year's break, but no votes will happen until next year. House Speaker Mike Johnson adjourned his chamber last week. Johnson and other Republican leadership have made it clear that they will support the foreign military aid package once the Democrats make enough concessions on border policy. Democrats are lashing out at Republicans for not approving the aid for Ukraine. Senator Mark Warner posted on X, "You know who is going to have the best Christmas imaginable? Vladimir Putin. Our failure to renew Ukraine aid is a tremendous gift to him. We must get it done next year." And, these kind of comments really are dumb, although at least this one is relevant. Nikki Haley, I'm not sure if you guys saw this. If you follow me on Twitter, by the way, at @KyleAnzalone_, if you don't, I tweeted out this video of Nikki Haley where she says, You know what October 7th is? Yes, it's the day that Hamas attacked Israel. But why? October 7th is also Vladimir Putin's birthday. And so she's trying to convince people that Hamas did the attack as on southern Israel as a birthday gift to Vladimir Putin. One of the things I think people are rightfully concerned about Nikki Haley. In her polling numbers at this point, she's polling quite well. And while that is concerning, I don't think she is very sharp. And my real hope is that, once the American people start paying attention to the words coming out of her mouth and not just, what the news writes about her, what her, the clips of her Twitter account that her staffers could put together that make her look good, what other people say about her. I think as she has to kind of get out in front of the public more and more herself, her poll numbers are going to come crashing down quite quickly, like we've seen in the past few years with the likes of even like Carly Fiorina, Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar. There's a lot of these people that, their poll numbers go up because the American people are so desperate to have a normal human being running for president, somebody that they could vote for. And then, once these people start to reveal themselves, everybody realizes that every last one of them is an absolute cretin that nobody wants anything to do anything with. And so my guess is that the Republicans, it looks like they're going to end up with Trump. I looked at, I'm surprised VVAT's polling numbers aren't a little bit better. It's like 6% or something like that. Not very good, but Nikki Haley's are strong at the moment. Now back to this, Ukraine aid stuff. So I think we would probably have to get to March or April before there is, I would call like a huge impact on what Ukraine is able to do on the battlefield. I think that because there's going to be at least a couple months that the Europeans can provide weapons to Ukraine. Now, there may be some particular Patriot interceptors or something like that where other countries don't have massive stockpiles of these interceptors. And so there may be some certain storage like that. But I could also see the White House using some creative / straight up illegal ways to figure out how to funnel at least a specific number, a small number in certain weapon systems to Ukraine to cover any shortages that the Europeans have for a short amount of time. But I don't think that the political situation in Europe will allow for this coalition of the European Union to continue arming Ukraine for an extended period of time. And I don't think that the U.S. could, fudge numbers in the Pentagon because, we're talking about $100 billion here. This isn't a rounding error kind of number where you could continue to arm Ukraine through 2024. So I do think that, the Senate will probably have a couple weeks to a couple months, the Senate and the House, to pass as $111 billion bill before it really starts to disrupt the Ukrainian war effort. My guess is that the White House hopefully has signaled to Ukraine, about the political landscape in the U.S., hopefully starting a couple months ago, but at least starting at the beginning of December, and really emphasize to the Ukrainians, like, hey, it may be a good idea to get in some defensive positions right now and try to rely on weapons that you have surpluses of, because if you don't have very many of something, you might not be getting more for some time. And so you might want to keep what you have as like a reserve crisis situation, for certain weapon systems and things like that. And so it probably has, and there's been reporting that it has already impacted the Ukrainian operations to some extent. But, that significant impact where you would see like the Ukrainian army maybe collapse, I'm not sure that, that's on the horizon in mid-January. I think, you had to look to maybe March and April down the line. And then, again, I think probably with the National Defense Authorization Act, the 2024 NDAA, being passed by Congress, my guess is that the Biden administration will be able to squeeze some funds out of that bill, a few $1 billion here and there for Ukraine. All right, next up here, U.S. eyes frozen Russian central bank funds to fund Ukraine. And this, seems like one of the possibilities that the Biden administration can act on to essentially circumvent Congress here and to keep this war going if Congress isn't able to pass the Ukraine bill. Now, I kind of assume that they will, because I think there's an overwhelming number. My guess is 80 to 90% of Congress would, if just an up and down vote on the Ukraine aid, I think 80 to 90% of Congress would vote for it. I think at this point, the Republicans are just trying to use that issue as leverage. I guess it makes a little bit of political sense since Biden has really built his administration around the war in Ukraine, the war in Israel. And so, feeling like this is a place you could apply a lot of pressure to the White House and get some concessions, politically kind of made sense. Of course, it's so cynical to do to the Ukrainians, who the Republicans have said that, arming them in their fight means more than anything else in the world for the past few years, to then turn around and use it, just as leverage on a separate political issue against the Democrats. So, Biden's responsible for putting himself in this position. He did propose that $111 billion funding package that grouped all this stuff together. But, just saying. So one of the things the Biden administration might do, and I'm guessing they're not going to get too much pushback from the Republicans on this, and that eventually Congress will pass some sort of Ukraine aid. So this probably won't have to happen, but it would be extremely provocative if it did. The Biden administration is quietly signaling its support for seizing more than $300 billion in frozen Russian central bank assets to fund Ukraine, the New York Times reported on Thursday. The central bank funds are held in the U.S., Europe, and Japan, and were frozen using sanctions implemented after Russia invaded Ukraine last year. Stealing the funds and giving them to Ukraine would be an unprecedented move and would take the U.S.-led Western economic war against Russia to another level. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen previously said seizing the funds without action from Congress is not something that is legally permissible in the United States. U.S. officials have also been concerned that the move would make other countries hesitant to keep funds in dollars or at the New York Federal Reserve Bank. But as the Biden administration is struggling to get Congress to authorize more funding for the proxy war, it's taking a closer look at the idea of using the Russian funds. According to the Times, the U.S. has been discussing the issue in recent weeks with fellow Group of Seven nations and pressured them to come up with a strategy by February 24th, the 2-year anniversary of the Russian invasion. President Biden has yet to sign off on the strategy as the details are being worked out. One issue that needs to be settled is whether the funds will go directly to Ukraine or to be distributed in another way. G7 officials are also discussing whether the funds should be limited to spending on Ukraine's government and reconstruction or used on the military as well. And I think one major problem with this is if we're talking about $300 billion, that's a significant amount of money, especially for Russia. In the U.S., it's a third of the defense budget, but in Russia, it's, a couple years worth of the defense budget. And so seizing $300 million is probably something that Russia would ask to be refunded in any agreement to end the war in Ukraine and normalize relations between Russia and the West. And of course, the major problem there is it would be a huge political issue in the United States to get Congress to pass funding to give to Russia. Right. And you know what I mean? Like we see with the Iran situation, right, where there's a few $1 billion, we're talking $6 billion of frozen Iranian money. And every time the U.S. tries to give Iran back the money, Congress will try to intervene often and prevent them from doing so, even though it's frozen Iranian funds. And so if that's the political dynamics in the U.S. around giving the Iranians access to their frozen funds, including giving the Iranians access to their frozen funds, but only allowing the Iranians to contract with Qatar and for Qatar to use those funds to purchase only a limited number of humanitarian goods for Iran. That being the situation in the United States, not being politically tenable, I don't think it would ever really work out politically in the United States to be able to reimburse Russia this money, assuming we spend it all and then Russia asks for it back at a later date. All right. Last story on the situation in Europe here. U.S. granted access to military bases in Denmark under New Deal. The U.S. and Denmark signed a defense cooperation agreement these are DCAs on Thursday that grants the U.S. military access to bases in the Nordic nation and allows the storage of U.S. weapons on Danish soil. Denmark was one of the original 12 members of NATO when the alliance was founded in 1949, but had a long-standing policy of not allowing foreign militaries to be permanently stationed on its territory. Denmark is now breaking from that policy, as Danish Prime Minister said the DCA means that American soldiers and equipment can be permanently stationed on Danish soil. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his Danish counterpart signed the deal in Washington. The DCA now needs to be ratified by Denmark's parliament. Blinken said once the deal goes into effect, the two militaries will be able to coordinate more effectively, and even more effectively than they already are. And of course, this comes as the U.S. has signed quite a few defense cooperation agreements this year. These are updated and expanded defense cooperation agreements. So Sweden, Norway are two other countries that we signed them with, and those come with more bases and deploying more U.S. troops to those countries. All right. A little bit of good news here. This is, if anybody needs some good news heading into their Christmas weekend, I probably just stopped the show after this story. U.S. China hold first high-level meeting military talks in over a year. So Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Charles Q. Brown, spoke with his Chinese counterpart, General Lao Zhenil, in a video call on Thursday, marking the first high-level military talks between the U.S. and China over a year. China halted such communications in August of 2022 in response to then U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi provocative trip to Taiwan. China also declined to hold a meeting earlier this year between Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and the former Chinese defense minister because that defense minister is under U.S. sanctions, which the Biden administration refused to lift. He has since been removed from that position. I'm not quite sure what the backstory is there. The Pentagon said that the call between Brown and his Chinese counterpart on Thursday, the two leaders discussed the importance of working together to responsibly manage competition, avoid miscalculations, and maintain open and direct lines of communication. The Chinese Defense Ministry said the U.S. called on China called on the U.S. to earnestly respect China's territorial sovereignty and maritime rights in the interest and in the South China Sea. In recent years, the U.S. has significantly stepped up its military presence in the South China Sea and is strongly backing the Philippines in its dispute with China. The conversation came about a month after President Biden met with the Chinese president, and the two leaders agreed to resume military dialogue. NBC News reported on Wednesday that Xi told Biden during the meeting that China will eventually reunify with Taiwan, preferably by peaceful means. The NBC report caused a stir among China hawks in the U.S., but Xi was repeating what has been China's official position for decades. Chinese officials often say they seek peaceful reunification, but do not rule out using force. According to NBC, Xi also said predictions that China might invade Taiwan by 2025 or 2027 were wrong because he has not set a time frame. And look, China and for a long time Taiwan have recognized, and with the new Taiwanese government eyeing more towards independence, but China and Taiwan have acknowledged that they were one political entity, and they just had two separate governments, and Taiwan essentially being in an independent situation from China. It governs itself and everything like that. China would call it like a renegade province, where I think the Taiwanese would see them, the government of China haven't gone too far down the communist path. So anyways, let's move on now to Israel news. We have quite a bit here. I wrote this one for antiwar.com on December 20th. As Gaza death toll crosses 20,000, aid groups warn true number is higher. After 10 weeks of Israeli military operations in Gaza, authorities have counted 20,000 dead Palestinians. An overwhelming number of the dead are innocent civilians with no ties to Hamas. An aid group warns that the actual death toll is probably higher, since thousands of missing Gazans remain buried under the rubble. Israeli officials say civilian deaths are viewed as a part of eliminating Hamas. This is from a press release from the UN Office for Coordination of Human Affairs, that's OCHA. And the press release said, as the official death toll in Gaza passes 20,000, Islamic Relief is worrying that the actual toll is likely to be even higher, as thousands of people are still missing and buried under the rubble, and young children are increasingly suffering severe hunger and disease. To see 20,000 people and killed such a short span of time is a strain on the world's conscience. According to the Gaza Government Media Office, the dead include 8,000 children, 6,200 women, at least 50,000 people are injured. And so I know that there are people in the United States who like to dispute these numbers and claim, oh, this is a Hamas death toll, so obviously it's inflated. And look, I think typically in these war zones, it's good to be skeptical of the death counts and understanding that typically death counts are coming from one side or the other, and each side has a political motivation to try to inflate or deflate the numbers based on their political motivations. However, if you look back historically and you read even mainstream media reports on this, they say that even the Hamas run Gaza Health Ministry reports accurate numbers, that they have a particular procedure that they use, and it creates accurate numbers for counting the number of dead, where if somebody is killed and that body shows up either at a morgue or a hospital, I'm guessing there may be some other kind of official sites right now in Gaza, maybe UN shelters or something like that, where officials are able to record the dead and they're able to say, okay, this person died on this day, he was this year old, and they go through, they do a electronic entry, they find that person's official ID number, and they mark that person as deceased. And so in a war zone like Gaza, I'm not saying that there's maybe no mistakes to that. It's not impossible that somebody's body got counted twice somehow, and that needs to be sussed out, or maybe somebody has the same name as their cousin. Somebody shows up at a morgue and they say, this is my cousin so-and-so. Well, if you have two cousins so-and-sos that are roughly the same age, maybe you record the wrong one instead. Yeah, these kinds of things may be happening. I'm not saying that the Gaza list of names is absolutely 100% perfect and accurate. I'm just saying that generally speaking, these numbers are going to be roughly reflective of the truth. I'm sure within maybe a few hundred or something like that. And then we also have even Barbara Leaf, who's a U.S. Biden administration official, saying the numbers are likely an undercount. And this is what has consistently come out throughout this war from, unbiased sources like different aid agencies, the UN and things like that have made these claims, or even, people you would presume to be pro-Israel, Biden administration officials, have also come out and said the same thing. So I think that's really important to acknowledge that this is likely an undercount. There's no reason to assume that these are massively inflated Hamas numbers. And if you look at the number of children and women killed being roughly 70% of the total death toll here, it's just, and look, I actually think that might be worse. My guess is if you look at the kind of people who end up dying like under rubble, it probably is, just crushes children, their small frames, their weaker bones, a lot easier than an adult, particularly an adult male. And, they may be able to dig their way out of the rubble, where a child, if you got like 50 pounds on top of them, they're never going to be able to get themselves out. And there's really not a whole lot of effort or way for the people of Palestine to dig out their dead at this time, because, the Israeli forces are raining down bombs and bullets on these people. And so, this is the middle of an active war zone. You can't even go recover and count your dead at this point. So, that disparity could actually get worse. And that also assumes that all the men that are being killed are members of Hamas, which isn't true. But in the toll, or the count that's put out by the Palestinian Health Ministry, the Gaza Health Ministry there, they don't differentiate between who is and who isn't. So you could say at least 70% or so of the people killed are innocent civilians, but with that last 30%, it's yet to be determined. So, an Israeli official told reporters on Wednesday that the mass destruction of civilian targets in Gaza is a part of Tel Aviv's strategy for defeating Hamas. Reuters reports a legal advisor to the Israeli Defense Forces said the IDF was carrying out thousands and thousands of attacks, and often attacks that require heavy firepower to destroy tunnels used by Hamas under Gaza. He added, really tragically, that results in a large number of civilian casualties. And this isn't the first time we've had this admission from Israeli sources. Last month, the Israeli outlet Plus 972 magazine, which I believe is the area code for Tel Aviv, that's why it has that name, might be Jerusalem, but I'm pretty sure it's Tel Aviv, reported speaking with sources who said that the civilian deaths were intentional. This is a statement from one of the sources that magazine spoke with. Nothing happens by accident when a 3-year-old girl is killed in a home in Gaza. It's because someone in the army decided it wasn't a big deal for her to be killed. That is what a price worth paying in order to hit another target. We are not Hamas. These are not random rockets. Everything is intentional. We know how much collateral damage there is in every home. The article also explains that Israel is targeting what they call power targets, which includes infrastructure such as high-rise apartment buildings, banks, universities, and other public buildings. The OCHA press release described the result of the Israeli policy. It says, the destruction is staggering, with at least 60% of homes and 96% of schools now reportedly damaged or destroyed, and almost 80% of hospitals no longer able to function. The Israeli bombardment has targeted regions that were labeled safe zones, and this is from an Al Jazeera reporter on the ground in Rafah. More airstrikes are conducted, more victims fall due to the expansion of the Israeli military operations in areas that are supposed to be safe zones, where the majority of Gazans have been urged to flee. The airstrikes took place in an area considered to be very densely populated, and it's a miracle that more than this number of people were killed. The extreme damage to infrastructure has created a humanitarian crisis that is threatening the lives of a vast number of Palestinians. A group say there are little food or medical services available. Human Rights Watch says Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war against the Palestinians who live in Gaza. The UN and World Health Organization has warned that the healthcare system in Gaza is near collapsing. The OCHA statement adds, more than 10 weeks of relentless Israeli assault has flattened much of Gaza and left civilians desperately searching for food, water, medicine, and fuel. Most people are now going whole days without food, and most civilians are now suffering severe hunger. Hundreds of thousands of people are crammed into makeshift shelters, and heavy rain and falling temperatures are making conditions even worse, as tents have been flooded and children are rapidly becoming sick. And we will talk more about the humanitarian situation here. First, this one by Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com. UN report says over 570,000 people are starving in Gaza. 1 in 4 Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip, that's over 570,000 people, are starving due to the Israeli siege, according to a report using data from the UN and other aid agencies that was released on Thursday. The report, published by Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, said the Israeli onslaught in Gaza has caused catastrophic levels of acute food insecurity across the Gaza Strip. The IPC has a 5-phase scale for malnutrition, as the report estimates the entire population in Gaza is now in phase 3 or higher. Phase 3 is defined as households either have food consumption that gaps are reflected by high or above usual acute malnutrition, or are marginally able to meet minimum food needs, but only by depleting essential livelihood assets through crisis coping strategies. And so they're saying that, maybe households are taking everything they have, selling it off, and using that to buy food. And so it's not a sustainable way. It's going to just get them food for a short period of time. 1 in 4 households in Gaza are in phase 5, which means catastrophic famine-like conditions. Phase 5 is defined as households have an extreme lack of food and or other basic needs even after full employment of coping strategies. Starvation, death, destitution, and extremely critical acute malnutrition levels are evident. For famine classification, the area needs to have extreme critical levels of acute malnutrition and mortality. And so, we're getting to the first part, right? Because people that have, a little bit of fat on their bones and things like that, your body will use that up before you really enter the full starvation mode. And so, after 10 weeks, it seems like that's where people are getting, especially young children are starting to get into the acute malnutrition. And so once they start dying, then this will become a famine. And, they're talking about here, these are households who these people have nothing, right? Like, they have sold everything they own, or it's been destroyed by Israel. They've tried to go to every shelter they can. They've looked for food at every place they can. And now they just have nothing. Their family has nothing, and their children are going without. The IPC report came after Human Rights Watch said Israel was committing war crimes by using starvation as a weapon of war against the Gaza civilian population. HRW said Israeli forces were deliberately blocking the delivery of water, food, and fuel while willfully impeding the humanitarian assistance, apparently razing agricultural areas, and depriving the civilian population of objects indispensable to their survival. When the Israeli onslaught first began after October 7th, Hamas attack on southern Israel, the Israeli Defense Minister Gallant announced a complete siege on the already blocked enclave and said that Israel was fighting human animals in Gaza, which is home to over 1 million children. Over 20,000 Palestinians have been killed in the U.S.-backed Israeli slaughter so far, including over 8,000 children, and as the war continues, many more children will die from starvation and death of disease than actually, in the airstrikes and things like that. All right, now let's talk about the medical infrastructure in Gaza. I wrote this for the Libertarian Institute. No functional hospitals remain in North Gaza. The World Health Organization, that's the WHO, reports that all hospitals in northern Gaza are no longer functional. Only 9 of the 36 hospitals in Gaza before October 7th are operational at any level. And I believe 4 of those are minimally operational, which means maybe they receive like very critically injured new patients and are probably conducting a lot of their medical operations without the medical supplies that they need. I'm not sure if this minimally operational may mean you have like anesthesia and some painkiller medications, but in a limited number of antibiotics, but they're probably like operating on people on the floor and things like that in a lot of these places. So the WHO Emergency Medical Team Coordinator, Sean Casey, described the scene at the Al-Ali Hospital as patients were crying out in pain, but they were also crying out for us to give them water. Medical staff had no food, no fuel, no water. It looks more like hospice now than a hospital, but a hospice implies a level of care that the doctors and nurses are unable to provide. It is pretty unbearable to see somebody with casts on multiple limbs, external fixator on multiple limbs, without drinking water and almost no IV fluids available. At any moment, it's a place where people are waiting to die unless we are able to move them to a safer location where they could receive care. Israel raided the Al-Ali hospital on Monday. Most of the medical staff were detained, and a tank destroyed a wall. The head of orthopedic surgery at the hospital, Fidel Naim, said that the raid put the hospital out of action. We can't receive patients are injured. According to our information, there are dozens of wounded in the surrounding streets. Israel claims its operations inside of Gaza are aimed at eliminating Hamas. Last month, the IDF raided the Al-Shifa hospital, asserting the tunnels under the hospital were used as a Hamas command center. However, an investigation into the Israeli claims released by the Washington Post, published on Tuesday, concluded the evidence presented by the Israeli government falls short of showing that Hamas had been using the hospital as a command and control center, according to the Post analysis of the open source visuals, satellite imagery, and all the publicly released IDF materials. And so, again, that's the most mainstream of mainstream U.S. media outlets, one of the most Biden-loving media outlets, coming out and saying that this operation that the Biden administration said there was intelligence, the Israeli government claimed it, but Biden reiterated it, that this hospital was being used by Hamas command and control center, and that's why it had to be decimated. That's why this hospital had to be put out of action. And I'm sure that dozens, if not hundreds of Palestinian children have been dead because of the destruction of these hospitals, right? And they said we had to do this because this was a Hamas command and control center. For that to be wrong, there needs to be some sort of political ramifications in the United States, particularly for the Biden administration. I mean, this is unbearable to have, our country supporting the intentional decimation of medical facilities based on lies and then repeating those lies to the American people. And look, if it was 2015 in Kabul and Obama is lying to cover up for the war crimes of American soldiers after they destroyed a hospital, at least he's doing it in the defense of the American soldiers. Biden is doing this for a foreign government. All right. So recently, WHO Director General warned that there are signs of epidemic and disease in Gaza, including bloody diarrhea and jaundice. He added that Gaza's healthcare system is on its knees and collapsing. Israeli professors have warned that a lack of sewage infrastructure means disease is likely to run rampant. The WHO statement released on Thursday confirmed the situation in Gaza has progressed towards the worst case scenario. Gaza is already experiencing soaring rates of infectious diseases. Over 100,000 cases of diarrhea have been reported since mid-October. Half of those are among young children under the age of 5. Over 150,000 cases of upper respiratory infection and numerous cases of meningitis, skin rashes, scabies, lice, and chickenpox have been reported. Hepatitis is also suspected as many people present with telltale signs of jaundice. The WHO warns that a combination of epidemic and starvation will be fatal. An estimated 20% of Gazan households are facing starvation. And the WHO statement continues, while a healthy body can more easily fight off diseases, a wasted and weakened body will struggle. Hunger weakens the body's defenses and opens the door for disease. The people of Gaza who have already suffered enough now face death from starvation and disease that could easily be treated with a functioning healthcare system. This must stop. And so, it's not only the starvation of the people and the destruction of the healthcare system. Israel is also decimating any kind of media that exists in Israel, in Gaza. And this is, absolutely prevents any insight into and real revelation of the war crimes that are happening in Gaza. I wrote this one for the Libertarian Institute, December 21st. Rights groups warn in Gaza, most dangerous situation for journalists ever seen. The Committee to Protect Journalists reports that in 10 weeks of war in Gaza have killed more journalists than in 1 year of any other conflict. Over 60 journalists have been killed, while many reporting on the brutal Israeli onslaught in Gaza. Investigations into some of the attacks have determined the assault was intentional. So this is CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists, Mid-East and North Africa Program Coordinator, said the Israel-Gaza war is the most dangerous situation for journalists we have ever seen, and these figures show that clearly. The Israeli army has killed more journalists in 10 weeks than any other army or entity has in a single year. And with every journalist killed, the war becomes harder to document and to understand. And think about this and go back. There's been a few journalists that were killed during the war in Ukraine, some by Russia. And when it happens by Russia, that is used by all these, Americans who are now defending, sending arms to Israel by saying that Russia is killing journalists. This proves how evil the Russians are, how awful Putin is, and how we have to, support Ukraine and make sure we stop Russia, or else they're going to invade all of Europe, and they're going to kill all the journalists and prevent any reporting. Well, you actually had that situation going on in Gaza, and the U.S. is supporting it and trying to downplay the crimes by Israel. A joint investigation by Reuters, Human Rights Watch, AFP, and Amnesty International concluded that an Israeli tank shelled a group of easily identified journalists, killing a Reuters videographer, Assam Adala. AFP said in its report, the strikes were deliberate and targeted, coming close together in time and space, and hitting journalists who were clearly identified as press away from any military activity. Dylan Collins, an AFP videographer who was with Abdallah when he was killed, said, "We felt safe, we felt secure, so we got to work. 7 journalists, all of us wearing flat jackets and helmets. Everyone clearly marked as members of the press. The Israelis knew we were there from the moment we arrived." CPJ President Jody Ginsburg said the concentration of journalists killed in the Israeli-Gaza war has been unparalleled in CPJ's history and underscores how grave the situation is for the press on the ground. Local Palestinian journalists continuing to report from Gaza while living in fear for their lives. The sheer number of journalist casualties only months into the war brings into sharp focus the dire need for the warring parties to commit to protecting civilians, including journalists. The CPJ report is backed by recent statements from Reporters Without Borders. Alfonso Baluz, president of RSF Spain, said this 2023 has been a catastrophic year due to the massacre of journalists in Gaza, which we will not be able to forget. He added that the deaths show an unprecedented scale of the tragedy for journalism in Gaza. CPJ urged Israel and the international community to facilitate immediate access to humanitarian aid and basic supplies to Gaza and the safe delivery of personal protective equipment such as helmets and flat jackets to journalists in Gaza and the occupied West Bank, as well as ensuring media credentials and press insignia are respected and that parties follow international humanitarian law and do not target or harm journalists. The group reports at least 67 journalists have been killed since October 7th. It's worth knowing that 4 of those journalists were Israelis that were killed on October 7th. CPJ called on Israel to grant international news organizations access to Gaza and halt the practice of communication blackouts and repeal new regulations that allow for the shutdown of news organizations and the administration detention of journalists, which allows for imprisonment without charge. I'm guessing Israel isn't going to meet any of those demands, but it's very important to understand the situation for journalists in Gaza, because I think it's reflective of, how they're just treating the civilian population in general. But there's a lot of war crimes that are being committed in Gaza on a daily basis that we're not learning about. And that's because Israel has been so effective in, killing many journalists in Gaza. All right, next up here, hostage talks resume, but several hurdles remain before deal reached. I wrote this for antiwar.com on December 20th. Israel and militant groups based in Gaza have resumed talks on reaching an agreement that would see Israeli hostages released. However, the parties demand remain far apart. The Wall Street Journal reports the talks will be held in Egypt and include representatives from Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, PIJ. PIJ is another militia group that's based in Gaza. On October 7th, members of PIJ also crossed into southern Israel and took captives. The Wall Street Journal reports Egyptian officials say Israel is demanding Hamas release 40 captives, including all women, children, and elderly men with compromised health, in exchange for a 1-week pause in fighting. According to the journal, Hamas is seeking a 2-week pause in fighting. However, the Hamas political leader met with Iranian officials on Tuesday and said the group was seeking a permanent ceasefire. The problem this time is different interpretations from Israel and Hamas, and this is what he said according to Al Jazeera. Hamas insists this time the deal cannot be a prisoner exchange solely. It must be based on a permanent ceasefire. A separate Hamas official said, "Our vision is clear. We want to stop the aggression. What is going on the ground is big catastrophe." Hamas says the remaining female captives are soldiers in the Israeli military. PIJ is requesting a ceasefire before any hostage release agreement. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says a permanent end to the war with Hamas is not possible, as Tel Aviv is determined to eradicate the group. He said, "Whoever thinks we will stop is detached from reality. All Hamas terrorists, from the first to the last, are dead men walking." A previous hostage agreement saw Hamas release dozens of women and children captive in exchange for Israel releasing Palestinian women and children imprisoned by Tel Aviv. That agreement broke down on December 1st, and Israel resumed military operations in Gaza. At the end of the ceasefire, over 100 Israelis remain captive in Gaza. Initially, Tel Aviv rejected proposals to resume the talks, but the talks resumed in Poland earlier in this week. The Financial Times reported that Tel Aviv became more motivated to restart negotiations after Israeli forces in Gaza killed 3 Israeli citizens who had escaped captivity. One source described the talks as positive, but the source added that a deal was not imminent. President Joe Biden was also pessimistic about a deal in the short term. He said, "There is no expectation at this point, but we are pushing." It is unclear what pushing Biden is referring to, as the White House has refused to place any conditions on the support it provides to Israel. Humanitarian organizations are demanding at least a temporary pause to fighting in Gaza due to the crisis unfolding. Aid groups say there is little food or medical services available. Human Rights Watch says Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war against the Palestinians who live in Gaza. The UN and World Health Organization have warned that the healthcare system in the besieged enclave is near collapse. All right, so one other little mention on this. Father of hostage killed by IDF says Israel has video of his son's death, and he says that the army has the footage of the IDF shooting his son, but has refused to release it. The Times provided additional details about the video, how they got it. It appears the IDF sent a dog in, and that dog actually reached the hostages, but that dog was killed. But the video that was attached to the dog kept running, and I guess was running for a few days. The captives were sitting there trying to talk to the camera, telling them that they needed help, and I guess nobody was watching the camera. And so once these men escaped, they were waving a white flag and gunned down by the Israeli forces. Interesting, because I think it shows that if Israel's killing their own hostages waving white flags, then these soldiers are either trigger happy or on orders to just, gun people down. UN Security Council delays vote on Gaza resolution yet again. The UN Security Council pushed back a vote on a Gaza resolution that was initially scheduled to be brought forward for a vote on Monday. The vote is now scheduled for Friday and was delayed throughout the week due to a threat of a U.S. veto. The U.S. worked to water down the resolution and remove a call for cessation of hostilities. According to AFP, after negotiators worked on Thursday, Thursday. The latest draft of the resolution calls for creating the conditions for a sustainable cessation of hostilities, but does not call for a ceasefire. Another major sticking point about the resolution, which was put forward by the UAE, would call for the UN to have exclusive control over inspections of humanitarian aid before it enters Gaza, something that the US and Israel reject. According to the Washington Post, the UN wanted a more flexible language on the issue. The Post reports that the new draft circulated on Thursday satisfied at least some of the U.S. concerns, enough that the U.S. would abstain from voting and would not veto the resolution. U.S. officials said they also want to include language condemning Hamas and supporting Israel's right to self-defense, but is unclear if such a wording was included. The U.S. has vetoed several resolutions calling for ceasefires at the Security Council to give political cover to the Israeli massacre of Palestinians. The U.S. also voted against a ceasefire resolution in the UN General Assembly, which received support from 153 countries. And so, this has some important implications for the U.S. kind of being on its own in the world, but also just shows how dedicated the Biden administration is to this absurd policy to never call for a ceasefire in Gaza. Absolutely disgusting. I wrote this one for the Institute on December 20th. Officials say Israel nearing full-scale war against Hezbollah. Israeli officials said Tel Aviv is moving closer to a full-scale war with Hezbollah. The Israeli Defense Forces and Hezbollah have traded fire along the Lebanon-Israel border since October 7th. An IDF spokesperson said Monday, "We are closer today to war with Hezbollah than we were yesterday, and the directive to the IDF is, of course, to enhance readiness to prepare and to be capable of defending Israeli civilians." At a separate event, the Israeli defense minister explained that if restoring security in the area could not be implemented diplomatically, then we will not hesitate to act. Last week, an IDF official told Newsweek that Tel Aviv plans to remove Hezbollah from the Lebanese border. "We will not return to the situation that was on the 6th of October in the north. It means we will not allow our civilians neither in the Gaza envelope nor near Lebanon, the Lebanese border, to be under threat." The official continued, "We are prepared for war with Hezbollah. We are on alert for that. We have people, the personnel that is exactly ready for that, but we don't want to do that yet." The leader of Hezbollah explained the paramilitary group is attacking Israel to force Tel Aviv to split its forces between Gaza in the south and along the Lebanese border in the north. He said Hezbollah is not seeking a wider conflict with Israel. The IDF has hit several civilian targets in Lebanon. A group of easily identified journalists in southern Lebanon were attacked by an Israeli tank, leaving one dead. Israel has also deployed white phosphorus in Lebanon. The weapon is outlawed in populated areas because of the intense burns it can cause to innocent people. The White House is backing the Israeli proposal to have Hezbollah withdraw from the Israeli border. According to the Financial Times, the US, UK, and France are exploring ways to convince Hezbollah to pull back from the Lebanon-Israel border in a diplomatic push to prevent a full-blown conflict from erupting between the militant group and Israel. Replacing Hezbollah with the Lebanese military along the border could open up a window for an attack on southern Lebanon, as Hezbollah is by far the most superior fighting force in Lebanon. And so, I think that last part's very important, that if Israel is really looking to push back on southern Lebanon, if the U.S. convinces Hezbollah to withdraw from the border, this could obviously give Israel a prime opportunity as the conflict winds down in Gaza to go ahead and try to attack the Lebanese army and take this territory, push the Lebanese army back. And then I guess a second issue here is it's just crazy that, you have these situations where the U.S. has a ton of leverage it could use on Israel to lever down the tensions, but it doesn't want to do that. It only wants to try to, use its military might and threat to threaten groups like Hezbollah to say, oh, you have to comply with this. Not, we're going to have Israel tamp down on the genocide in Gaza, and that could allow for the situation in the north to really settle down. All right, next up here. U.S. forces have come under attack over 100 times in Iraq and Syria since October. Pentagon officials say that U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria have come under attack at least 102 times since October 17th, when the attack started due to U.S. support for the Israeli onslaught in Gaza. The Pentagon official told Military Times that the number includes 47 attacks in Iraq and 55 in Syria that involved a mix of one-way attack drones, rockets, mortars, and close-range ballistic missiles. At least 66 U.S. troops have been injured in the attack so far, including 5 who have been awarded Purple Hearts. U.S. officials say most of the rockets and drones fired at U.S. bases didn't reach their intended target. And the number of U.S. troops injured is a little interesting because when we were about halfway through, I would say at about 60 attacks, the number of attacks and the number of injured U.S. troops was relatively the same. And it seems like, since maybe mid-November or so, the U.S. either isn't recording the troop injuries as they were, they're not reporting the troop injuries as they were, or maybe the U.S. has done something in the way it positions our soldiers that makes it that they're less likely to come under fire and be injured from these attacks. Most of the attacks have been claimed by the Islamic Resistance of Iraq, an umbrella group of Iraqi Shia militias. The U.S. has launched several rounds of airstrikes in Iraq and Syria in response to the attacks, and specifically targeted Kataib Hezbollah, one of the main Iran-aligned Shia militias in Iraq. The latest attack that's been confirmed by the U.S. military took place on Wednesday. U.S. Central Command said a 122 millimeter rocket was fired at the Din al-Assad Air Base in western Iraq, causing no casualties or damage. In 2022, the Iraqi parliament voted to expel all foreign military forces over a U.S. drone strike in Iraq that killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani and Iraqi militia leader Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes. The U.S. refused to leave Iraq and pressured the Iraqi government to allow its forces to stay in an effort to placate anti-U.S. factions. The U.S. formally changed its presence in Iraq from a combat role to an advisory role in December of 2021 to help in the fight against the ISIS remains. But the U.S. did not withdraw any troops at that time, and there are 2,500 troops in that country today. In Syria, the U.S. bats the Kurdish-led SDF and has about 900 troops occupying the eastern portion of that country, where most of Syria's oil reserves are located. The U.S. occupation is part of the economic war against Syria, which involves crippling economic sanctions, specifically designed to prevent the country's reconstruction. The U.S. also occupies some of the more lucrative, economically viable portions of land in Syria. And so that, that's also really harming and saying bad Syrian reconstruction. All right, that does it for the show today, everyone. I will be back with definitely 3 shows next week. There will be 3 shows. I'm not quite sure what the schedule of the first show will be, but definitely a show Wednesday and Friday next week. Guys, thank you so much for all of the support that you've given this show and the Institute over the year. Keep tuning in, and if you can, make a donation to the Institute. Thanks, everyone.